Hello, and thank you for joining us in Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to informal discussion of the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Cody. I am one of the hosts.
I'm Will.
I'm Luke.
And I'm Kate.
And this is our first episode on Mason and Dixon, Pynchon's 1997 novel that is, I think, many would consider among his best, and kind of painfully under-discussed outside of the Pynchon circle. So hopefully we can kind of provide some insight into it, or at least our own, and find out what we can about this book. It's one of my favorites. I've only read it once, but I absolutely fell in love with it. So we're, I think, all excited to dive into this one. We've got a summary. Will, do you want to go ahead and summarize the first 5 chapters that we read?
Absolutely. So Mason and Dixon starts with the first of 3 sections, Latitudes and Departures, which itself begins with the stage setting of the festive season of New England in 1786. We are introduced not only to the parlor room of the Cherrycoke household, full of sturdy furniture and bustling with cheer, but to its regular afternoon inhabitants, Pitt and Pliny, twins whose collaborative dialogue drives ceaselessly for one tale another from their uncle, the well-traveled Reverend Wicks Cherrycoke, as Tenebrae, the eldest, assumes her position of adolescent ambivalence in a nearby seat while practicing embroidery. The twins enter, carrying a cornucopia of baked treats, with a fresh pot of coffee for the kind uncle. They beseech him for a tale of America, with Indians and Frenchwomen, and this, it seems, stirs in the Reverend some melancholic grief, as he tries to recall some of the scenes from his travels with the titular pair. We're told how Wicks has only ended up here, boarding with his sister's family, affording bed and meal only through distraction of his niece and nephews for their parents' benefit, because of a late arrival, missing his old friend Charles Mason's funeral and burial. Leaping beyond that pain, he starts his tale by announcing his former imprisonment, which led to his hanging, which did not lead to his death, despite all appearances. Or perhaps there was no prison, no charge, only a bad relationship with his father, who paid him to abscond himself from Great Britain and a flight of fancy. Perhaps his father detested his hideous crime of anonymous publication of letters, an admitted charge eked out by the arrival of his patrilineal counterpart, Uncle Ives. In the end, he settles on a starting place of the Tower of London, or at least some jail in the vicinity. In this abject place, he was labeled mad and prescribed a large dose of maritime therapy, that is to say, sent out upon a naval vessel during wartime. The Reverend goes on to complain about this course of treatment, and is compassionately offered to stay in a lunatic asylum instead, refusing this boon, thanking the officer for such grace, and, with advice to steer clear of various harmful substances, Wicks Cherrycoke embarks on his journey. The next chapter begins with a poetically and earnestly written letter from Jerimiah Dixon to Charles Mason. They've both been contracted, as yet strangers to each other, to take observations on the transit of Venus from Sumatra. He apologizes for his ignorance in the scientific arts of astronomy, but pledges to learn. Dixon will later admit that he tortured himself with sobriety while penning draft after draft of this letter, and Mason, chagrined, in kind shares that he had initially meant to discard the letter, assuming it to be basically junk mail. Dixon's sincere belief in he as a teacher embarrasses the cynical scientist, so he himself pens a reply, in which he tries to temper his partner's expectations of himself, details the equipment they'll be relying upon, and tries his best to mirror a shade of Dixon's warmth. The pair's first meeting is relayed to us by the Reverend, himself knowing the story only second-hand. By his memory, they rendezvoused in a saloon in Portsmouth, and before setting off in pursuit of their last chance for a civilized drink, Mason begins to disillusion Dixon of his expectations. Charles was not a charismatic social climber, but left quite a bit to be desired in the social polity indeed, bringing out thrilling tales of the hangings at Tyburn, as well as poor impressions of a Durham accent. Dixon's amiable country charm ensures that no quarrel breaks out before they can both attain the safety found in a light souse. Their acquaintance is interrupted by the appearance of a talking terrier, stage name Learned English Dog, though called Fang by friends. He sings, answers questions of trivia and philosophies natural and intellectual, and inspires in Mason a hope for reincarnation, for his wife has only in the past year left this mortal station. Going out back to discuss these supernatural matters with the LED, the duo are interrupted by a faulty business proposition from a crew member of their chartered craft, Fenderbelly Bodine. A nearby macaroni challenges Fang to a duel while the dog is telling Mason the open secret of his provenance. The fop is scared away with a threat of rabies, and Fang leads Mason and Dixon to hire a local seer. Dixon flirts with the secretly youthful woman while she tries to warn them off their voyage. Apparently, many French sea captains take no heed from such frivolities as cause for engagement. At dawn, hoping to ask further of her, this time of a personal matter, Mason cannot find neither sign nor hair of either the dog or the scryer. Apparently, the Captain Smith of the Seahorse, styling himself a man of scientific inclination, billed the men each a share equal to his own, in pursuit of nightly dinner discourse with the lens and compassman. The Royal Society, taking this as an underhanded recoupment of misspent funds from a rogue officer, raised quite a stink. Eventually, Mason, Dixon, and Smith come to a mutual understanding, the pair apologizing for the misapprehension, and they end up dining in the mess. Only days before setting sail, the Navy tells Smith, "Do not sail to Bencoolen in Sumatra. The French have taken control there." They decide that the South African Cape, though curiously abandoned by other observers, will make for serviceable records of the transit and substitute. As they proceed southernly, this seems to be going smoothly, if a bit tense, when a French vessel, the Legrand, is seen. The duo and Reverend make quick work of learning naval medicine and practice their sphincter exercises below deck while the battle surges overhead. In this crucible of blood and terror and nausea, the astronomers' links of friendship are forged and hardened beyond difference in religious upbringing or social prowess. The skirmish, started for no cause except a peculiar bellicosity of the French ship, soon ends, either because France is not at war with the sciences, which would go down in naval history, or because they mistook a spare mast for reinforcements from the British. When night falls, Mason and Dixon, making the metaphorical literal, brace upon each other as crutches as they stumble to their cabin. They arrive in Plymouth and prepare to write to the Royal Society as justification for their delay in departure and adjustment of destination. They recognize now is when they decide either to call the partnership quits or to continue on together. Manly as ever, they refrain from speaking candidly, instead complimenting one another's religions. They sit drinking, discussing, untangling the events that had just occurred. Why didn't the powers that be have a simple conversation before they set off? Why would the French Empire fear a single jackass frigate? Mason wonders of crossed timelines, misplaced history, while Dixon for once leans conspiratorial. Whatever betrayal may or may not have taken place to put them in that ship's hold, it pales compared to the response to their plea for understanding. The Society clearly has appraised them as scam artists, making tales up for the sake of fleeing their obligations. The pair cannot decide whose mentor has betrayed which of them, but prepare for the other shoe either way.
All right. Thank you. That was great. Kate, did you want? So we talked about this a minute ago before we started the recording, and the first line of this book is, I think, just absolutely stunning. Kate, you volunteered to read that one for us. Would you mind going ahead and doing that?
Absolutely. Chapter 1 begins thusly. Snowballs have flown their arcs, starred the sides of outbuildings, as of cousins, carried hats away into the brisk wind off Delaware. The sleds are brought in and their runners carefully dried and greased, shoes deposited in the back hall, a stockinged foot descent made upon the great kitchen, and a purposeful dither since morning, punctuated by the ringing lids of various boilers and stewing pots, fragrant with pie spices, peeled fruits, suet, heated sugar, the children, having all upon the fly among rhythmic slaps of butter and spoon, coaxed and stolen what they might, proceed, as upon each afternoon, all this snowy advent, to a comfortable room at the rear of the house, years since given over to their carefree assaults.
So, I don't know about y'all. As much as Gravity's Rainbow kind of gets the credit of the best like opening line, I think this might actually be, in my opinion, more impactful. Not to take anything away from the, screaming comes across the sky. I think that's an iconic line. I just think that what he does in this sentence, it's a longer sentence, but I think so perfectly encapsulates and sets the tone for everything that's to come in this book.
Oh yeah, I agree completely. Like the warmth that most people will talk about experiencing reading Mason and Dixon, and like the sheer sort of human level of the book is pretty perfectly established in that, as he just takes the most poetic way possible to describe children playing outside in the snow and then coming back inside to have dinner with their family.
There is some similarities between the Gravity's Rainbow opening and the opening of this book. I mean, snowballs have flown their arcs. It's describing the flight of an inanimate object. And the B-2 rockets would have also had an arc in their flight. I think the Pynchon Wiki kind of points that out, but there are some similarities between the two openings.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, even in a broader sense, getting right along to talking about food in the same way that Gravity's Rainbow opens.
Yeah, that's true. I hadn't thought about that.
Can't be at better tasting food, probably.
Yeah.
Hey now.
A little bit of banana goes a long way.
Banana, everything is the minimum.
So let's start at the beginning, kind of not even narratively, but I want to talk about a couple of things about how this book is written and how that impacts the story itself. So I think that the most noticeable feature of this for anyone who has not read it yet is the way in which it is written. It is written in an 18th century style. So much so, and I think Kate mentioned this on either the Lot 49 wrap up or maybe even an episode before when we were just casually mentioning it. It's done so well that there are scholars who consider this an 18th century novel because it is so accurately written in the style of that time that you could plug it into that time frame and it fits perfectly. Aside from some of the maybe anachronisms and just kind of general weirdness of it that wasn't necessarily present in a lot of those works, but stylistically it is spot on for that.
Yeah, I remember my first time with this book just kind of not knowing what to do with it, because it's not just that it's written in the style of a book from the 1700s, it's also written in the style of the dialogue of a book from the 1700s. Spelling is really up for, opinion in this book. It's not consistent page to page. Its E's are often elided in favor of apostrophes in ways that actually don't, further a description of pronunciation. It's just this incredible combination of accurate dialect, but completely inaccurate writing style.
Yeah, I mean, continuing even to a further point in the dialogue, like accents are also represented accurately. If there's a character from a different part of England, for example, Mason and Dixon have very different ways of speaking. That's represented just in the way that words are spelled and the way that sentences are constructed.
Yeah, and I mean the prose of this novel, it is written as if it's all being said out loud, which seems kind of obvious, but when you think about it, there's not a lot of descriptions of settings. There's not a lot of descriptions of people. It's told in a way that's a very verbal storytelling style, which I'm not 100% sure how common that was for 18th century novels. But I do think that a lot of 18th century novels probably had more descriptions and were less verbally based, I would say.
Yeah, and so that brings us to the other part of this that kind of sets it apart is its use of frame narrative in having Cherrycoke tell the story not only to us as the reader, but also to the kids that he is staying with, or rather in the house that he's staying with in order to stay at the house. It's not a very commonly used literary device, at least not in my experience. I think I may have read a few other books here and there that are that make use of it, not to the extent that this does. I think a lot of times there's other smaller stories within the story. Lot 49 did it with the Courier's Tragedy, but the way he does it is just so perfectly executed that it like Luke was saying, like it feels more like someone's just telling the story to you than rather than you're reading the book. So it really kind of, I think it adds to kind of adds a level of immersion that would otherwise be missing.
Yeah, and for any first-time readers, I strongly recommend keeping an eye on where in the frame narrative the book is at any given point. Is it coming from the parlor room? Is it coming from the thoughts of the Reverend? Is it coming from the story? Or is it coming from somewhere else?
Which especially becomes, which we'll obviously get into further down the book, but especially becomes more important when like the ghastly fop gets introduced and you have multiple layers of frame narrative working over the top of one another. Keeping an eye on where the chapters are starting and who's actually involved in the frame at any given moment is incredibly important as far as being able to follow along with what Pynchon is doing.
Yeah, so for anyone who didn't listen to the Lot 49 wrap up and is new to this book, it's important, I think, to not get frustrated if you get a little bit lost in this. I know the first time I read it, I repeatedly had to go back and kind of backtrack to kind of pick up like what Will and Kate were saying, to kind of realign myself with where in the narrative things were taking place and what part of Cherrycoke's storytelling is this happening and whose perspective are we seeing this from, and so on and so forth. So, and even with this subsequent read through and doing it for this podcast, I still was going back every now and then to kind of check myself and make sure I knew, where I was. That being said, I did find it a little bit easier this time with the language itself, and getting used to that didn't take as much effort as it did the first time. I think once you've kind of read through the book and you get a feel for how the language works and how he's using the words he's using, it makes it a little bit easier to stay with it and keep a pretty good flow through it.
Yeah, for all the chaos of the mixed capitalization and the contrasting neologisms and archaisms, it is a dialect of English. You read it, and with just a little bit of practice, it does read quite transparently, and it's not something to worry about unless it's taken you forever on the first chapter. Yeah,
and on that note, something that helped me a little bit with this subsequent read through of it, and I found this on the Pynchon wiki, is regarding the capitalization of letters, because like Will had mentioned earlier, you have all these random words that are capitalized, and when you're looking at it for the first time, it seems wrong almost because we're not used to that. The way it's done, at least according to the Pynchon wiki, is that the capitalizations are used to differentiate homonyms. So nouns are capitalized and verbs are not. And keeping that in mind while I was reading through it this time actually kind of helped with understanding what specifically he was saying and understanding the reason for those words being capitalized and the emphasis that they put on each sentence.
And obviously, like, this podcast grew out of the Pynchon subreddit. A lot of people, when the Pynchon subreddit did its group read, I think that was last year, maybe the year before, mentioned that reading it out loud helped them make that conversion in their mind as well. So if you're finding it particularly hard to do that just within your own head, a lot of people have found it to be pretty successful to try reading a paragraph or even a page or two out loud to kind of help their brain switch over.
That's true for a lot of Pynchon as well, I would say. I mean, there's times when there's passages in Gravity's Rainbow in the past that I've struggled with, and after reading them out loud, they kind of became a little bit more legible.
Yeah, and the audiobook, apparently, I think it was Will that was saying the audiobook is really, really good and very helpful. I don't have a copy of it, unfortunately, but I have heard good things about it. So maybe go that route if reading it is a little bit of a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd even go so far to say that this is a book that, while it's incredibly long and experimental in most ways, it's also one that, if you're going to pollute a nice quiet evening in with the family or friends with you reading aloud, it's not going to be terribly disturbing. It's quite
Yeah.
it's when it's read aloud, it comes across as old-timey and charming. It doesn't come across as erudite and pretentious. It's you can assume the role of the Reverend and just sit and tell the story of him telling the story.
That's true. And as someone with two young kids, like, I can absolutely vouch for that. There's not a lot of, I mean, at least in the first 5 chapters, and even going through it, from my last reading, I don't remember anything as graphic as some of the scenes in Gravity's Rainbow or Against the Day. So it's yeah, if you have kids and you're at that point where you're kind of needing to read it out loud, or you just want to because it's a different experience, there's really nothing I think that would cause concern if one of your kids walked in and heard you, or if your partner came in. It's a little easier to explain away like what you're reading. You don't have to, explain certain scenes in like Gravity's Rainbow and why that exists in there. So to kind of start our discussion, what I wanted to talk about first was going back to the frame narrative. Is I kind of took it, and I wanted to know how y'all took this as well, as very much a Pynchon self-insert, used to kind of discuss the process of being an author and kind of the different aspects of that. Like, for instance, he talks about, when Cherrycoke is talking to the kids, it's mentioned that on page 6, as long as he can keep the children amused, he may remain. So he has this kind of, as an author, as a storyteller, like, his purpose is to entertain, and the moment that no longer is a possibility, then you're kind of out on your own.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other part of it too is being an author of history. Who gets to tell history? Where do we learn history from? I mean, there are going to be a lot of moments. There's enough just in the first 5 chapters where Cherrycoke should not have access to the information that he does because he's not in the room. You can say that probably Mason or Dixon told him about it later, but what you'll find as you go through the book is that there are a lot of points of view being presented that the narrator would not have been in the room for when they happened. And so as a result, you have these different ideas of different outcomes in history, different interpretations of history, where history comes from, who gets to write it down. If it's written down, does that make it more true than what actually happened? Those are all very big thematic ideas that Pynchon is playing with through the book. And to a certain degree, it even comes through in you, the reader, participating in that process. What do you remember from this? How would you sum up this? What meaning would you pull out of this area or that area? And where does this book, lie in contention with the actual story of the drawing of the Mason and Dixon line? Obviously, this is a fictionalized account, but not entirely. So I think it is certainly about being an author, but also inviting the reader to consider who gets to be authors of history in particular, and where we end up with our interpretations of history as a result of who chooses to be an author or who gets to be one.
Yeah, and the first explicit sign of that we see is right in the first chapter, where Cherrycoke is basically meandering, trying to decide how much he wants to dress up his story to his nephews. He was hanged, but he survived, and then he was in jail, and then he went mad. And how much of that is true? How much of it is just his dad had a problem with him? How much of it is he was a reverend who wrote some political things? Who knows? We can't know.
Or how much of it is just a guy trying desperately to keep up his room and board? He has a distinct incentive to keep doing this.
Yeah, you got to know your audience and keep them entertained.
Yeah, and you see that extend past the explicit audience of the twins, with Tenebrae speaking up and Uncle Ives jumping in, and later on everyone else coming into the room. Yeah,
and then a little later, what I found to be a really interesting passage in this, in thinking about it as this introduction kind of being Pynchon or Cherrycoke, kind of relating the authorial experience and talking about the telling of stories, and like Kate mentioned about who gets to tell the story and who gets to whose interpretation are you getting, and how that affects the story. On page 8, I just want to read this paragraph. "'Twas not too many years before the war. What we were doing out in that country together was brave, scientific beyond my understanding, and ultimately meaningless. We were putting a straight line through the heart of the wilderness, 8 yards wide and due west, in order to separate two proprietorships, granted when the world was yet feudal, and but 8 years later to be nullified by the war for independence." So the idea that all this work, all this effort was put into what was ultimately a pointless endeavor. The whole purpose of them creating this line and mapping out this disputed territory just ended up being null and void by the end of it. But I think in looking at that in the storytelling kind of idea or mindset, it kind of goes to show that with a story, it doesn't have to be about everything coming together at the end and the happy ending and everything, all the loose ends get tied together. It can be just about the journey, not the destination.
Yeah, I think it's hard to ignore that, especially when the next thing that the Reverend's talking about is alluding to the idea that he's not actually a Reverend. He's just dressed up as one. It's a personical disguise. The campaign to cut the line through that parallel didn't matter, but it still happened. And just like he's not a real Reverend, but he still did all the things to make him look like one. What's the difference?
And in the end, whether or not the line had meaning or had value, the fact of the matter is, by the end of everything that happens, you have this friendship that's forged and the story that's told, of the two of them coming together and the things that they experienced along the way. Not necessarily, it doesn't have to be about everything. The line had this purpose and it ultimately served history and made everything better or worse or whatever the case may be. It's it doesn't have to be that. It can just be that here's this wonderful story about these two guys who don't know each other and are coming from essentially opposing ideologies, but find a way to become friends and more than friends, really. And I think by the end of it, they have this very deep bond that is formed by the end of the book.
Absolutely. I mean, you can even look at the idea of the journey, not the destination, being a motivator behind how they end up in this position in the first place. Because they don't get to the destination that they were supposed to. They're way late on the journey and they have to turn around. And it's the process of that waylaying on the journey and the unexpected nature of it that leads them to consider whether or not they're supposed to be around one another for a longer period or for something more important in the first place, which is a big part of what the end of this first chunk of chapters really circles around.
Yeah, and if the book was actually about the destination rather than the journey, you would think it would start closer to them creating the line. We get a fair amount of chapters before they're even in America, which I enjoyed those parts a lot. But they're not. If the story is about Mason and Dixon creating the Mason and Dixon line, it starts in a very kind of random, it starts whenever they meet each other, but it could have started much later, and the part about the line would not be any different. So
yeah, I mean, you wouldn't even have the need for the frame narrative aspect of it if that was what Pynchon was interested in doing. It could just be a more direct exposition of these two men drawing the line. But because of the fact that it's about a man specifically telling a story for as long as he possibly can so he can continue staying in a house, that's I think that's a very purposeful decision on behalf of Pynchon and how to present the story as a whole.
So before we move on past the premise of the frame narrative, what do you all make of the autobiographical reading of Wicks Cherrycoke, and in particular the crime they styled anonymity feature? Is that Wanda Chinaski? Dun dun dun.
That's I think before we answer that, if for anyone who's not familiar with the Wanda Tanaski thing, do you want to kind of explain briefly that whole bizarre story?
I cannot. Do any of you have a decent understanding of the Wanda Tanaski letters?
Wanda Tanaski was supposedly this bag lady who lived under, like, I think a bridge, I believe, yeah, in an area of Northern California. That was the theory behind this character that was created. In reality, most people believe that Thomas Pynchon was adopting this particular character to write a series of letters that he sent to magazines and newspapers in the 80s. And they've been collected later and published as a separate thing, so if you want to read all of them together, you can. But it was essentially a series of observations on, like, local artists, writers, like politicians, and a lot of people think that the humor and the polished nature of what was being written there makes it impossible for it to be the woman that it was supposed to be. And so Pynchon is most commonly brought up to be the actual writer of those letters. It's never been proven, but a lot of other people who were potentially closer to the actual goings on there have said that it was Pynchon, or that they think it was Pynchon. Tanaski talks about Boeing in the letters, so you have Pynchon's background in Boeing there. And so there are other individual matches between the two, basically, if you do a deep dive into specifically what is mentioned.
It also kind of dovetails out of there, because I think eventually they did find out it was I can't remember the guy's name. It was a different author, and he ended up, like, he had a lot of mental health issues or something. I think, if I remember right, he killed his wife and then killed himself shortly thereafter. And they found what was believed to be the typewriter that wrote all the letters in his house. But it wasn't the first time that Pynchon was accused of being someone else, or vice versa. I think someone also made the accusation that he was J.D. Salinger. And I think, if I recall correctly, in one of the Tanaski letters, I think he said, or she, supposing that Wanda Tanaski was a real person, that I think it was that Pynchon and Gaddis were the same person. Something like that. There was some weird, alluded connection between them. But I remember when Pynchon was accused of being J.D. Salinger, I think he actually responded to that with something to the effect of "nice try, but no." In one of his rare kind of, like, reaching out to clarify something moments. But anyways, so I don't want to go too off into the weeds. The Wanda Tanaski thing is a wild ride. I think there's a Wikipedia article on it. Go find it and read it, because it's absolutely bizarre. But I mean, as far to go back to Will's question, what was, so just to make sure I understand it right, are you wondering, like, how we are reading that particular, the crime of anonymity kind of thing in relation to Pynchon himself? Yeah,
whether or not you believe that Tanaski was Pynchon.
I don't think it was, just from, only because if I'm remembering right, when I went on a rabbit hole about it, I think they found the typewriter in that other guy's apartment after he died, and they were able to pretty conclusively link it to him. But I do think that line does have some reference to him in regards to how he kind of, I remember, I think it was on the Books of Some Substance podcast, they were talking to the guy that runs the waste mailing site about Lot 49, and he had mentioned that Pynchon was really paranoid after it came out and Gravity's Rainbow came out. I think he was he kind of, I guess, had convinced himself that he put too much out there as far as what he had kind of gathered from Boeing, and was afraid that it was going to come back on him, and that, the powers that be may be looking for him. So I think that might be somewhat of an allusion to that on that end, but I'm curious to hear what Kate and Luke think.
Hey man, I think there is definitely probably some intentional poking fun at that story, because it was wrapped up by the time this book came out. But as far as I'm aware, the evidence for, I think it's Tom Hawkins is the one that they think is.
Yes, that's the name.
Yeah, I believe that the circumstantial evidence, certainly, because no one's ever actually going to figure out for sure, is pretty strong. Like, Tom Hawkins lived in the same county, was a fan of a lot of postmodernist writers as well, also worked for Boeing. There was a fair amount of circumstantial evidence pointing to him. So I think it could easily just be Pynchon playing into the rumors about himself and just sort of looking back on that period that had ended only a couple years, well, almost 10 years prior, and just kind of saying, that was wild. Does anyone remember that? Or like maybe just leaving a joke in there for people who followed his career.
Yeah, that's basically how I interpret it, is at the very least, it's poking fun at the idea that, hey, you think that you have liberty, but instead you're just held by whatever previous, decisions you made. He can't talk about certain things because he worked with Boeing and they have a file on him kind of thing.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think this was also around the time that, was it CNN claimed they had a picture of him that they were going to put out on a news broadcast, and he actually got to the point of like calling them and basically telling them like, I'm not reclusive, I just don't like being photographed, and I like to keep my personal life personal. I think that was around this like mid 90s era, and that may play into it as well.
That was an actual news report that was being put out for the release of Mason and Dixon.
That's what it was.
CNN wanted to track him down and like interview him and I guess try and trick him into doing a public appearance. And the best part of that video, which you can watch it's on YouTube, is they show a random shot of just New York City like street traffic, and they say, well, we're not going to show the photo of him that we have because he kindly requested that we do not. He is one of the people in this crowd. Yeah. Which one he is, we won't tell you.
Dozens of people, front and back facing.
Yeah.
That was the thing with the Inherent Vice movie as well, is there was a rumor that he was an extra in the movie or something like that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think Joaquin Phoenix was claiming... No, it wasn't. It was Josh Brolin claimed he was an extra in there, and then P.T. Anderson said, no, he wasn't. He was on set, but he was never on camera, kind of thing. So I can't help but think that he's partly controlling that too, just to get a laugh. Like he knows that he could easily insert himself in there and then have two different sides say two different things just so that no one ever really knows the truth. But he does, and he can laugh about it while the rest of us try to figure it out.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. I mean, there's even a background extra in that movie that looks a lot like a younger Pynchon if the photo from the National Enquirer is actually him. And I think that probably what started as just a desire to not deal with the media very quickly became something that he realized he could have fun with and mess with people. And that's, I think, where it's pretty much stayed since then.
So I think the last thing I wanted to bring up regarding the kind of self-insert frame narrative. Let me see. I need to go back and kind of reread that particular line, but yeah, so there was another, I think the last line that I kind of felt had a reference to that being an author and its place in society. On page 22, there's the line, nonetheless, however accomplished, our lives are never settled. We go on as tail wagging, I'm going to butcher this word, Scherzeradze's ever a step away from the dread palm leaf, nightly delaying the blades of our masters by telling back to them tales of their humanity. So that kind of, that kind of like telling a story to keep your room and board, also telling a story to save your ass at the end of the day. If it's what you can do and if it's what you're good at, then you have that control over certain situations.
Yeah, and that word is Scheherazade.
Scheherazade, thank you. I should know that because my family's German, but
she's
not going to hear me correctly.
She's the narrator of the 1001 Arabian Nights.
Okay, that's...
Which, if you're familiar with the frame narrative of 1001 Arabian Nights, it is a woman who has been wed to I think it's a sultan who is known for murdering every single woman that he is wed to. And she tricks him into this bargain where if he enjoys the stories that she tells at the end of the day until he falls asleep, then she won't be murdered. And so the reason why it's a series of stories, one after the other, is that she's continuing to try and basically elongate her stay of execution by entertaining her husband.
Yeah, and the 1001 Arabian Nights is, there's more than 1,000, less than 1,000. Who knows how many tales there are? But in almost all of the popular compilations, the end of that frame narrative is Scheherazade having essentially won the undying love of her husband and no longer having to fear for the next morning. And you gotta wonder, with the possibly autobiographical frame narrative combined with just name dropping Scheherazade within the first 3 chapters, is that supposed to be meaningful?
Oh, I'm sure it is.
So the next thing I wanted to bring up, I think with a lot of Pynchon's work, there's the kind of ongoing discussion of predestination and free will, and we kind of touched on this with Lot 49 as well, but it also shows up in here. The names Wesley and Whitefield that first pop up on page 9. I looked into them, and I want to do more research on them because I wasn't familiar with them at all. But they are basically, both were religious figures at the time. I think both were preachers or reverends. One was Wesley was a proponent of predestination, and Whitefield was a proponent of free will. And I think it didn't surprise me at all that he would insert something like this related to those two concepts this early in this book. And I think, like I said, it comes up in a lot of his books, but I think it's always interesting to have his dynamic and that inclusion of those concepts into his work, and how they influence, in this case, Mason and Dixon, because I think both, are on opposite ends of that. So I kind of wanted to get y'all's thoughts on that.
Yeah, just as background information, George Whitefield was an Anglican reverend, and then Wesley is most likely a reference to the cleric John Wesley, who was originally part of the Church of England, but then founded the Methodist movement, and that is very much a opposite ends of the spectrum as far as predestination. So you are correct in that conflict being there.
That's what I gathered, yeah.
But as far as its bearing on the text, I think that there is a pretty explicit conversation between Mason and Dixon after the battle in which the seahorses destroyed mostly, but they live, where they basically ask this question, where they say, were we fated to meet one another? Were we fated to do something together? Because the fact that we're alive, the fact that the ship was attacked in the first place, the fact that the ship wasn't destroyed completely, it just doesn't make sense. And that's where a lot of the lightly conspiratorial elements come in chapters 4 and 5. But more so, it gets to them questioning whether or not they're meant to be drawn towards one another, which pushes towards a predestination argument. And if I'm not mistaken, it is brought up by the one of the pair that doesn't believe in that religiously, and so it's almost as if they're kind of undergoing an opposite conversion process, where something has convinced him enough that there may be something predestined here, because the facts of it all just don't add up. It doesn't make sense why things would have happened the way they happened if that wasn't the case. So I think it's definitely going into the wider thematic elements of the book, this idea of not just who writes history, but also how does history happen. I think it's a question that gets posed as two opposing views. And there's not really, as far as I remember from my previous reading of the book, there's not really a hard answer there. It isn't as if Pynchon tells you that things are predestined. I mean, Pynchon is descended from a quite famous reverend in the United States who had his tract banned, but I don't believe that he's making an advocation for predestination entirely. I think it's another question of not just who gets to write history, who gets to pose history to the people who weren't there when it happened, but also how do these things happen in the first place? How do these people end up together? Is it a matter of coincidence, or is there something deeper at play? Is there a capital T they there that's getting them together and putting them into these situations where they're the only ones who could have taken this action or done this particular thing?
Yeah, and within the context of his other two big books, as you know, the big three, they're often called. I see the discussion of predestination and free will in this book. Yes, it was a contemporaneous religious argument that was very meaningful, but this is at the very beginning of what we call modernity. Well, not the very beginning, but the beginning of what we call modernity. And as scientific tools were developed, as understandings of the world around us, there was this simultaneous kind of split ideology where we could secularly understand the world. We could predict what could happen. We could set things in motion and control them. And at the same time, an embracing of complete liberty, complete free will. And most of that, I believe, grew out of, argument over religion. Basically the secular people were the more scientific ones, and they wanted to not be treated as though they were pawns of the religious. But as a result, it led to this weird split way of thinking where the world is entirely caused. Things are predestined. However, people are not predestined. And it's an issue that continually comes up throughout this book in particular, as well as the rest of his big novels.
Yeah, what I'm about to say is maybe perhaps neither here nor there, but deism is addressed in this book a fair amount, and I think a lot of our listeners will know this, but deism was very popular among the founding fathers, and it's a religious belief, a type of Christianity, I guess, where God is said to have created the world as if it was like a machine and just kind of let it run. And abdicated any direct role in the goings on of man and animals and stuff, which is interesting to think about in the context of free will versus determinism. I don't know. It's almost a form of atheism or agnosticism as well, which is interesting to think about as well, because religion at this time, especially in England, I want to say, but even in the new colonies in America, religion was such a major deal. There was, people would argue about it. People would start wars over religion and stuff like that. So,
well, I think you could even, now that I'm kind of thinking about that concept about the deism being as big as it was then, if you're looking at taking that concept like you explained it, Luke, of the idea of God creating everything, like a machine, as you said, and then stepping back to let it do its thing. Maybe something like the learned English dog that comes in a little bit later, was you could maybe make the argument that it's kind of pushing that idea, like, this dog, or maybe a better example would be the duck later on, but whether or not this dog was given that intellect that he has by its creator, who then stepped back to see how it is, and will a dog still be a dog if given the opportunity? Is it going to go down that path, or is it going to become something else? I think that's kind of that just popped into my mind about how that would work in that idea with deism.
And I think the other interesting sort of wrinkle that you can add specifically to talking about the learned English dog that kind of combines what both Will and Luke have said, is that if deism is the case, that the watchmaker analogy is exactly correct, that there was a god who set up this machine and just allows things to be brought to its full end, then the LED is a perfect example of the age of science coming in and deliberately messing with that plan. Because as far as I remember, if I'm correct, the dog kind of posits this idea that man wanted dogs to be more and more man-like. They kept praising them for like behaviors or things that were similar to humanity. That's what they found cute. That's what they found endearing. And so they kept pushing that to its natural conclusion until finally you end up with a talking dog. What's more man-like? What's more man-like in a possibility than giving the dog the ability to actually reason and think and communicate, which would almost certainly be in exact opposition to what a deity would have set up in place. So looking at it as the age of science, you can really take a view of it that he's making an example here that the age of science directly disrupts religious belief and directly disrupts what even something close to atheism like deism posits as an opportunity, which brings up further interesting questions about whether or not predestination is true. We live in this age of science that can disrupt the very plans of God, but perhaps we're still disruptible ourselves when those plans come to fruition.
Yeah, and kind of to invert that a little bit, this is the learned English dog who is a talking dog. This book, in playing with the pre-modern, is able to kind of get away with these fantastical elements. And in some ways, while the dog is sitting here explaining that, well, Darwinism, which has not been summarized yet effectively, but Darwinism is why I am the way I am. That is in itself commenting on the nature of those locuses of control on history that Wicks Cherrycoke is as well. He's sitting there making up a good story for his kids or for his nephews, and this dog is sitting around making up stories that might be true, might not be true, might not even be a talking dog. There could be that the Jellos are somehow hidden somewhere at all points where he speaks. We don't know that.
Yeah, I mean, he does, mention adding in, certain elements into his story to keep the kids entertained, which, as we mentioned, is his meal ticket, essentially. So, yeah, it wouldn't surprise me at all if he's just, throwing in, these goofy things like a talking dog to keep the kids entertained.
Especially when one considers that he was not here for when this was happening. Which really gets to the further point of the fact that there is a massive frame narrative, as we discussed at the top of the show, but you can even take that concept down to these individual moments, these individual scenes, sometimes even sentences, where you consider what is the frame here, what is the purpose of this inclusion, why is it being said, is this real, is it not? Which once again gets back to this idea of who is giving us our history, who writes it, do we believe it, or do we think that there's an alternate reason for it to be there?
Yeah, because you kind of have to consider, if he wasn't there, how many, like layers of filtration has this story gone through before it got to his version of it? It's like a never-ending game of telephone where, he heard it from someone who heard it from someone who heard it from someone who was there, and it just, by the end, it's just become this garbled thing where there's a talking dog that appears out of the mist one night while they're walking around the city.
Yeah, that chapter 3 even opens with him essentially saying, I might have written, look, Mason and Dixon told me about their meeting, and then I started writing it, and I might have fallen asleep and started dreaming and just kind of written my dreams into the story anyway, too.
Yeah. Something that I really like about, not just, you can make the argument for all of Pynchon's books being absolutely hilarious at times, but I think Mason and Dixon, there's a lot more humor that's present throughout. I think that kind of lends to its overall lightheartedness. It's not as bleak or nihilistic as some of his other works, but the humor that's peppered throughout here, both in things people say and these kind of weird ties into modern culture, like on page 10 where he's there's the line, "Keep away from harmful substances, in particular coffee, tobacco, and Indian hemp," which is basically just like a don't do drugs phrasing for the in the 18th century. I think the Pynchon Wiki had a specific mention of the Bill Clinton, like, "I did not inhale," somewhere as one of the things.
I think it's in the first chapter. Yeah.
Well, what
might
it
be,
says after "stay away from Indian hemp" is that if you have to use the last one, then do not inhale.
Do not inhale. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, and like all these little just goofy things, and then later on there's the kind of 18th century equivalent of beer before liquor, where it's great before grain but ne'er the twain, and vine with corn, beware the morn.
Yeah, I haven't come to any conclusions based on this line of reasoning, but I do feel like there's something about the grape and the grain distinction in this book that is supposed to be meaningful when it comes to characterization.
Well, that very well could be, because I think, if I remember correctly, Mason and Dixon are both favor the one of the two and not the other. And I'm wondering if that's like a societal thing, like, the people who drink wine versus the people who drink liquor. I didn't find anything about that, though.
It could be related to their religion, their denominations of Christianity as well. I'm not an expert on that, but I mean, Quakers, I would imagine, maybe have different habits than whatever Mason was.
Could also be a comment on their social status. One is considered to be the drink of more wealthy people.
Yeah, historically, grain is grown for everything in massive quantities, so fermenting it into beer and then from there distilling it into whiskey is not very expensive, and the grape is something that requires a ton of care and established vineyards.
Yeah, it's a refined kind of thing.
Yeah, and the British Isles, to my knowledge, don't grow a significant amount of grapes, but they do produce a lot of grain for their own, well, at this point, their own liquor production mostly. And so between the two, grape would be more associated with the continent for sure. And the grape would be associated with wealth, because not only is it, more expensive to take fruit and turn it into a beverage compared to a seed, but it's also, you have to import it, at least across the channel.
Yeah. So at the end of chapter 2, because chapter 2 is it's just basically two letters from and to Mason and Dixon. I found this fascinating, and I just wanted to kind of share it with anybody who's listening and wasn't aware of this. So it makes a mention at the end in Mason's letter. He talks about John Dolland and his marvelous achromatics, is how he refers to them. And I ended up going on this whole deep dive to kind of learn a little bit more about that. And it was really cool. What I learned was that he was an I think he was an optician. And he created these achromatic lenses, which what they do essentially is there's a dual set of lenses. One is concave and one is convex. And the way they filter red and blue wavelengths allowed for more precise focus in the lenses. So it really helped to further the science of things like astronomy, where the more focus you have, the better you can observe these celestial bodies and even things on on Earth. You can magnify better and see better. But in reading about it, it also had me thinking about that duality that exists in a lot of Pynchon's work, and especially in here, but also in stuff like Against the Day, where you have these two opposing characters or ideas that end up working in conjunction with each other. And I just thought that was a really interesting. One of those little things that's just in there, and it's just this offhanded reference, but the wealth of knowledge that you can gain from reading his work and diving into those little rabbit holes is just so fascinating.
So I just looked this up, and it seems like John Dolland was the son of Huguenot refugees. So he was of French Puritan stock. Mr. Ellicott, I can't find anything about, but his family was Cornish. So I'm guessing they're Anglican.
Probably.
And Mr. Bird was a noted Quaker. And I'm not sure about the Anglican Church at this point in time, or today, honestly. But both the Huguenots and the Quakers were believers in determinism. And sandwiching those two inventors around the man who invented essentially the modern clock escapement is something.
The Anglican Church is not a believer in determinism or predestination.
Okay, thank you. In which case, to me at least, that would make it more notable that he was in the middle. But I can't find his religion, so I'm not saying anything.
Okay, so I wanted to run this past y'all because this popped into my head while reading this, and I had to bring it up and see what y'all thought about this. And I may be way off base, and this is just my brain being weird in the ways that it's weird. I was getting this really weird X-Files vibe, specifically like Mulder and Scully from Mason and Dixon, just in their general characters, like the idea that Mason really buys into a lot of the pseudoscience, like with the Oracle and other things that come along the way, as a means of, I think it initially starts with his desire to reunite with his wife, who is, I think it briefly gets mentioned in these first 5 chapters, but it comes up later on that his wife had died, prior to the events of the story. But it's clear that he wants to reconnect with her in some way, whether it's, having some kind of a spiritual reconnection with her while he's alive or reconnecting with her after he dies. And Dixon seems to know better and not really believe in it, but he's curious about where all these little paths lead, and he's willing to go down. Similar to how Mulder's totally bought into all the pseudoscience stuff and desperately wants to believe that there's something out there, and Scully's just like, I mean, you're wrong, but sure, let's see where this goes. But becomes more convinced as things go. So I don't know if y'all see that connection or if I'm just making these weird connections, but that's something that came to me while reading this.
Unfortunately, I've not seen the X-Files, so I can't. I can't comment on that one.
Oh, really? Oh,
same. Yeah.
I maybe saw 1 or 2 episodes in the 90s, but it's been a long time.
I think the reason I thought it would have been on around the time he was wrapping things up on this, because it started airing, I think, in 92 or 3. So I don't know if listeners have anything to say on that. I would love to hear that, and it'd be nice to know I'm not alone in my crazy thoughts. Will, have you seen X-Files? Did you have any?
No, I mean, it was before my time, frankly.
You all have homework. I think it's on Hulu, maybe. Go watch it. It's super cheesy sci-fi. It's a product of its time. It's got a lot of that early 90s kind of CGI. There's some episodes that hold up really well and still hit hard and are somewhat scary at times. And there's others that are just absolute cornball, Tales from the Crypt level of cheese, but they kind of lean into it at times. The show ended terribly, and they tried to bring it back, and it just wasn't really the same. But it's good for most of its run. So,
I think it's a pretty safe bet that Pinchin would have at least seen a few episodes of it.
I like to think so. It was huge at the time. Like I said, that he was writing it or wrapping up on it. So I don't know how much influence it would have had, honestly, just because how long he had been working on it. But it's just something that came to my mind. As far as throwbacks, because we've talked before about how Pynchon likes to insert characters and different things into all of his books. In addition to the Bodine character that we have, who, correct me if I'm wrong, there's a Bodine in I think every Pynchon novel.
I'm not 100% on that. I'm thinking for some reason of Inherent Vice, and I'm not remembering any Bodines, but I don't know.
That's the one that I'm thinking too. Or Bleeding Edge either. I can't think.
There's Pig Bodine, and he's in Gravity's Rainbow.
He's in Gravity's Rainbow.
Yeah.
I thought there was a Bodine in Vineland also.
There might be one in Vineland. I can't remember though.
I can't either. But we have one here. So we have that reference, and then we also have the inconvenience, not just the name, but the fact that it's also a ship.
Yeah.
Gets brought up again, which for those of you who have read Against the Day, you'll know that reference.
Yeah, and it's in the same. It's in the same chapter as the talking dog.
Yes. Yeah. So let's talk about the what I think is one of the best parts of the chapters that we read, and that is the scenes on the seahorse. Just in a general sense, how did y'all feel about that whole part of this 5 chapters?
I enjoyed that part a lot. We were talking about Gene Wolfe before we started recording the episode, and I recently read Pirate Freedom by Wolfe, which has some similar passages, some descriptions of the amount of guns on a ship, where the guns are located, what pounds they are. I think whenever I was growing up, I used to read a fair amount of like nautical, I think it might have been more YA than adult literature, but stuff about like sea battles and stuff from around this time. So it's kind of a little, it's like I have a weird amount of familiarity with like some of the jargon and stuff. I really enjoyed this part. It is kind of montage like, because the combat is not described in a very like granular or like super detailed way. It's kind of, it's just a page or two, I want to say, of combat, and then they're back in the port. But it is probably one of the most exciting, if not the most exciting parts of the novel. Definitely probably the most violent, I would say.
Yeah, like you said, the combat itself is not discussed at length, but the amount of impact it has in, I think it's only a paragraph that really, maybe 2, that really talks about the battle itself, and it hits hard.
Yeah, it's 2 or 3 if you're being generous. But I'll be the dissenting opinion here actually, and I don't have any reasons for this, but I think just a combination of this being the least linear chapter thus far, and maybe in the entire book, in terms of just timeline of things, combined with the jumping between, relaying what Mason was relaying to relaying what the captain was relaying to guessing at the possible reasons for the French abandoning their attack. For some reason, when I've read this chapter, I feel on one hand that there's a ton of real beauty in chapter 4, but also that it covers the same ground repeatedly in a way that is fairly uncommon for Pynchon. And while I find those paragraphs that do describe the attack and the work under the deck gripping and intense and emotional, the rest I find kind of boring, tedious almost.
One thing I found was interesting about this chapter, I think it's this chapter, where they seem to be paranoid about possible spies or people tipping off the French about where they're going. They seem kind of paranoid about the Royal Society and their possible role and them being intercepted by the French. The more I think about it, it is kind of, it made me question, like, why would somebody want to stop them from going to Sumatra and just doing some astronomy observations and stuff. I I can't really tell if it's an early example of them being paranoid for no reason, or if there's a possible, reason for them to be paranoid. I just can't come up with any possible reasons.
Yeah, I don't think we're really given enough to substantiate that, but I think that might also be intentional. Having us as a reader kind of wondering, is there, like with Lot 49, that whole idea of is the paranoia real, or is it just paranoia? I do think it's funny, the description of the Captain Smith, when they basically ask, like, is this guy even a good captain? The response is basically like, well, he's alive. That counts for something. So it's just so it's matter of fact, but it has a very, like, that seems like the kind of thing that they would have said at that time. Like, yeah, the dude's alive. So that's, look at all the ones that aren't. And, that's your answer.
Well, and I think to the point about the paranoia too is because Mason and Dixon talk about it, they're trying to figure out how they should respond to the Royal Society, how they should, go about understanding why this happened, because there's just too many things that seem coincidental in it, and they can't come up with a reasoning why that would have occurred either, which is why they start thinking about, predestination, or there being some sort of divine intervention happening there to have fated the vessel to get attacked in that way, to keep the two of them together, which of course gets to the fact that they asked, a fortune teller for what the omens surrounding the vessel would be, and they were told that it was going to get attacked. So they go into this journey with an understanding, or at least a potential understanding, that things are going to go wrong. They do go wrong. They can't figure out why they would have, because nothing in it seems to make sense. They can't figure out why the Royal Society would have messed with them, and so they end up having to think to something more esoteric than just a simple conspiracy, which in a real, top level reading, astronomers looking to the stars for guidance and why things are happening to them, it seems pretty fitting.
It does seem to be kind of an early example of them being, I mean, maybe not, I guess illogical would be the opposite of logical, but it does seem like an early example of them overanalyzing and going beyond logic, and an early example of possible supernatural forces being at work in this novel, which is a recurring theme, I would say, especially with Mason.
So do we have a year, a time when this takes place? This would have been...
The letters aren't dated.
Yeah, the letters don't have a date stamp.
I want to say it might be 1766, although I may be wrong about that.
I think 65 is when Cherrycoke said they were surveying the line.
Yeah, you might be right. It might be 64 then. I don't know.
I think it would have been a few years before then. Regardless, it would have been either... It would have been around the 7 Years' War. And with that in mind, keeping in mind the perception of betrayal that Mason has with regard to his letter to Bradley, and the fact that it's not a secret, Odin and Mauve and Hepsi all know, and these are not like people in the naval intelligence field, know that there are all of these rogue ships setting sail off of Brest that are just attacking whoever's going by. The Navy tells them not to go to Ben-Kulin, and so they set sail for South Africa anyway, but still the same direction. I totally see the paranoia as valid in this case, because I mean, come on, why else would the French show up and then disappear? Why else would all of these things happen? And of course the answer is because that's life and random stuff occurs. But it's very hard not to see it as, like Dixon implies, they might have been martyrs They might have been sent to be killed for the sake of instigating another war.
Yeah, very true. To answer your question, chapter 3 ends by saying that the Seahorse set sail January 9th of 1761.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's going to be right in the middle of the 7 Years' War.
So something else I thought was interesting about Captain Smith, and it kind of ties into the whole. I don't want to say it ties into the predestination or anything, on that aspect of it, but I think it's an interesting look at the scientific mind and the warfaring mind, and because they kind of mention in after that whole bit about oh, he's alive, that's why he's a good captain. They also talk about how he's Captain Smith is a man of science, or he wants to be a man of science, and that it's kind of implied that may be what's gotten him out of a lot of scrapes, is that he's not thinking in a military mindset, he's thinking more as a scientist or scientifically. But then it's in the next paragraph, it's also implied that he also might just be lucky. So in thinking about that and them getting out of that attack, and coming out relatively I mean, a lot of people died, but how much of that was they were meant to get out of it, or how much of it was because of the actions of the mind of science of the captain.
Well, and you've got to wonder about the similarities between this naval battle and the one discussed around the beginning of Lot 49 that inspired the Peter Pingwood Society, with the ships that may or may not have been there, the engaging and disengaging at complete random without an actual campaign happening.
I think the other thing, the other big question I think for me is what a French ship smells like, because that was how they identified it, if I'm not mistaken. They what was it, Bongo? They called him here then Bongo. Smell wind, and then he basically confirms that it's French. I thought that was just a good use of humor to kind of undercut the tension that follows almost immediately thereafter.
So the French dialogue, or the dialogue with the Frenchman that follows, a page or so later, that's absolutely just straight out of Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
Oh, yeah, it's the French taunting. Yeah.
So
definitely.
I mean, think about all the talk of French and English smells in that movie.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I do like the choice of calling it the Le Grand.
Yeah, be the Grand.
Mm-hmm.
And I do. It's not. This is not relevant directly, but I do see a lot of the Jonah story, Jonah in the mouth of the whale, with the "All I've lost 30 of my crew. Are you two really that important?" that Smith brings to the pair.
Were there any other plot elements that anyone wanted to go over?
So I've been going over in my brain how to discuss this without doing spoilers. It is interesting that the beginning of the novel, the frame narrative, it's chronologically after everything that comes after it. Like we start at the end. And I having read this whole book in the last about 10 days, or reread the whole book in the last 10 days, and then restarted it to read the first 5 chapters again. It did kind of remind me of Infinite Jest, where Infinite Jest begins with chronologically the end of the book. Because we do get I want to. It's stated that Cherrycoke is in town with his family because he's there for Mason's funeral, which went over my head the first 2 times I read this book. I'm not really exactly sure why that happened, because it isn't belabored at all, but it is a pretty important aspect of the beginning. I think that Cherrycoke came into town to go to Mason's funeral, and then it seems like every day he goes to visit Mason's grave. And I don't want to spoil the ending of the book, but it does seem to be kind of a cool, like, kind of circular. Whenever you finish the book, you can just kind of pick it up and start reading it again. which I love books that do that. And I do think that Infinite Jest, I think, came out within a year or two of this book as well. So
Kind of like a Dark Tower kind of situation.
yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
I haven't read Infinite Jest, but Dark Tower definitely does that. With that, I don't want to spoil that, but it does do that. That circular.
Yeah. Infinite Jest was published in '96, so Pynchon would have had a year to read it, but I feel like potentially Mason and Dixon would have been done by then if I was to guess.
I would imagine it would have been like at least in editing stages at that point.
Well, and it's absolutely possible because we know that DFW did talk to like DeLillo and others predecessors while writing Infinite Jest, that he sent Pynchon an early draft.
Yeah, I was about to say. I mean, I'd be surprised if Pynchon didn't get an advanced review copy of Infinite Jest. Now that I think about it.
Oh yeah, I would imagine he did.
On the other hand, though, you know, people will insist that both Gravity's Rainbow and The Crying of Lot 49 have those kinds of circular structures. I fail to really see the relevance of that structure in Lot 49. I can see how people are looking at it. I'm not sure what value that has, but you know, people see it there, and it's definitely visible with Gravity's Rainbow too. So it's
I think it's more direct in Gravity's Rainbow. Yeah. And I agree that Lot 49, I don't really see it as circular personally.
I don't think it's circular. I think if someone's seeing it that way, I think they may be misconstruing what circular is. I think it brings it to the point. I think it's bringing it to a point that it feels like it's at the beginning because it has that sort of anticipatory ending where you're almost like setting up the story again, but it's definitely not going back to the beginning of it.
Yeah, that interpretation relies on reading the opening paragraph of Lot 49 as discrete from the rest of the chapter, I think. But my point was just to say that you know, he might have been inspired by Infinite Jest, he might have been inspired by previous works. But it's the circularity of this book, especially with how episodic each chapter is, it really does lend itself to just opening up and reading.
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, you can do that with Gravity's Rainbow too. I find myself just periodically picking up that book and just flipping to a random page, and just reading an episode or two, and then putting it back down. And I think you definitely could do the same with this. The only other thing I really wanted to bring up before we jump into quotes, there was just another funny part at the beginning of chapter 5 where Mason tells Dixon, "You're a Quaker, you're not supposed to believe in war." And Dixon's response is basically like, "Oh, well, I got kicked out, so I guess I can just kill anyone I want now." And then they kind of go on and in kind of discussing the differences in their religions, and Dixon says, "No, I've no problem with Anglicans." And Mason's response is, "Thank you. I welcome the return of at least an hour's more sleep each night, otherwise spent in fretfulness upon the question." I just think it's a good representation of the two of them and their demeanor with each other. Like, even though they come from different backgrounds and really conflicting backgrounds at that, like they're still respectful of each other and can joke with each other like that. And you can really see the beginnings of their friendship forming in there.
Yeah, it's very true to life dialogue too, because coming from a religious background, I was a minister for about 3 years. That is a lot of the kind of joking that happens interdenominationally between people. Mm-hmm. It's very accurate to real life.
Yeah, along those lines, but not as religiously relevant. The whole, someone ought to have told you, Captain, of that rutabaceous anemia which afflicts lensmen as a class. And it's just like, okay, yeah, that's just the most complicated way I think possible of saying, yeah, we're all skinflints. You should have known better.
Yeah. Yeah. Excuse me, was there anything else plot-wise anyone wanted to touch on before we jump into quotes?
Not for me.
Okay. Who wants to go first on quotes?
I think I can go first. My quote comes from page 45 in my edition, right at the end of our reading, actually, like right at the end of chapter 5, where they've gone through this discussion of trying to figure out what exactly happened, why this event on the Seahorse occurred the way that it did. And there's a quote here It starts with Mason speaking, where it says, "As if there were no single destiny," puzzles Mason, "but rather a choice among a great many possible ones, their number steadily diminishing each time a choice be made, till at last reduced to the events that do happen to us, as we pass among them through time unredeemable, much as a lens indeed may receive all the light from some vast celestial field of view, and reduce it to a single point. Suggests an optical person, your Mr. Bird, perhaps." I find that to be, not just a really poetic quote as far as describing kind of destiny, or how we can sometimes be railroaded into a path in life by the decisions that we make, because we cut off different possibilities from ourselves by doing one thing or the other, but also breaking down this concept of learned men, astronomers or scientists, looking at potential, deistic views of what's happening to them, but still doing so through the lens of their own equipment, talking about, being a lensman and how that relates to this idea that we might be on a path that is chosen for us by some sort of destiny or some sort of God. I find to be really integral to the overall structure of the book and the thematic intent that Pynchon is going for.
Yeah, I had that section marked in my book as well. I thought it was absolutely beautiful.
So my favorite quote is probably also probably the most Pynchon part of this part, the first 5 chapters for me. It's about the card table, and I'll read it right now. "So the wonderful card table, which exhibits the cheaper sinusoidal grain known in the trade as wandering heart, causing an illusion of depth into which for years children have gazed as into the illustrated pages of books, along with so many hinges, sliding mortises, hidden catches, and secret compartments that neither the twins nor their sister can say they have been to the end of it." It reminded me of something we talked about, I think it was in the last episode, of Joyce saying that, his works are going to give scholars something to talk about for years on end, because, and the Pynchon Wiki does point this out, but that, like, the part about hidden catches and secret compartments and stuff, it just kind of reminded me of Pynchon's longer novels in general, and how you can really tear them apart, and there's so many like hidden kind of, there's so many tangents, there's so much stuff like hidden inside of it, there's so much ground covered that you can't really ever wrap your head around all of it.
Yeah, for sure. For me, it was my favorite quote was this is on page 37 of my edition. I think the pagination is mostly the same in most versions, but it's at the very end of the page, and it starts, the Reverend only beams. "One reason humans remain young so long compared to other creatures is that the young are useful in many ways, among them in providing daily, by way of the evil creatures and slaughter they love, a denial of mortality clamorous enough to allow their elders release, if only for moments at a time, from its claims upon the attention." I think, for me at least, as a parent, that line hits a little harder, and I think that probably Pynchon having kids it kind of influenced that, and that the idea that we can kind of retain our youth, so to speak, for these small amounts of times through our children, and just in the way that they have, like, their outlook on life, their perception on things, and the way they view the world itself, I guess. Like, they're not focused on all the problems that adults have to worry about, and all the things that cause our anxieties and our stresses and everything like that. They're just living, and they're just having fun, and allowing yourself to kind of see that and get yourself wrapped up in that can kind of take away from you, the stresses and everything that you're dealing with, if only for a little while. But it kind of helps to increase our livelihood and our ability to live longer in a literal sense as well, just through having the experiencing the joy that they're experiencing secondhand.
Well, and especially because I believe Jackson Pynchon was born in 91.
I think so.
So yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if not just that quote, but also the presentation of this novel and and how it is so warm in it being a story being told to children wasn't a big part of kind of helping him square in his mind sort of that element of it. I wouldn't be surprised if that had changed some things for Pynchon as he was writing it.
It does seem obvious that Pynchon has done some verbal storytelling for this book. Yeah, I mean, I would honestly, I mean, this is kind of an aside, but it would have been really cool to be Pynchon's son and perhaps have him read like a working version of this book to him at bedtime or something.
Oh yeah,
there's really, I mean, this is not, I mean, we'll get into this, I think, more deeper into the book, but you know, it is kind of an edited version of the story. You know, like there's a lot of there's kind of gestures made at stuff like sex, but it's not explicit in the least. Unlike his other longer novels, or unlike any of his other novels, like a lot of stuff is implied rather than stated in terms of adult content.
Yeah, I could definitely see him testing a lot of these kind of episodes, you know, as bedtime stories. Will, what is your? Did we steal your quote again?
No.
Did you give us?
See, the issue is that this kind of very sentimental, romantic prose style is one that I love so much that I just can't ever settle on anything that I like more than other things. So I'm just gonna go for a big quote. The second page of the novel. This Christmastide of 1786, with the war settled and the nation bickering itself into fragments, wounds bodily and ghostly, great and small, go aching on, not every one commemorated, nor too often even recounted. Snow lies upon all Philadelphia, from river to river, whose further shores have so vanished behind curtains of ice fog, that the city today might be an isle upon an ocean. Ponds and creeks are frozen over, and the trees aglare to the last slightest twig. Nerve lines of concentrated light. Hammers and saws have fallen still. Bricks lie in snow-covered heaps. City sparrows in speckled outbursts hop in and out of what shelter there may be. The nightward sky, clouds blown to chalk smears, stretches above the northern liberties, Spring Garden and Germantown, its early moon pale as the snowdrifts. Smoke ascends from chimney pots, sledging parties adjourn indoors. Taverns bustle. Freshly infused coffee flows every place, borne about through rooms front and back, whilst Madeira, which has ever fueled association in these parts, is deployed nowadays like an ancient elixir upon the seething pot of politics, for the times are as impossible to calculate this advent as the distance to a star. And I mean, honest, like, you know, the rest of the chapters we read past the first one for this episode are a lot of dialogue, a lot less of that kind of meandering description. But whenever it pops up in this book, I do just sit there and reread it and reread it and read it aloud to myself and say it in different accents, because it's just the command of language that he is always exhibiting is stunning.
Oh, absolutely. I highlighted that section as well, and for the same reason, because I don't remember who said it earlier that there's not a lot of descriptive parts of this where the scenery is being set because of mainly due to the fact that it's being told the way it's being told. But when it is there, like it is there, it's so beautiful and it's so well done. And I think I mean, for me, that's one of my favorite parts of all of his books, but especially in this book, and I would even say Against the Day has like that whole towards the end, everything that took place in the Baltic area, all the descriptive parts of that section were so beautiful. It's mind blowing that a human being can so beautifully construct an image. There are not many authors, I think, that are capable of doing it on that level. And so when you have those moments, they're just so much more special.
Yeah, I'd agree, actually, that Against the Day has a lot of the same quantity and quality, but they differ in that I think of Against the Day as written as jazz. Like the cadence is what he's operating on, whereas here in this book, throughout, Sure, obviously cadence and stress is all important, but it really the little rhymes, the little assonants and consonants throughout the novel, they're everywhere. Even in the dialogue, there is wordplay. There is practically poetry.
I was going to say it's poetic, like through and through, absolutely poetic. I didn't put it in the notes, and I apologize for that. But if anyone has a most pinch-on part of the section that we read, Luke, did you have one? I thought you mentioned one earlier, or it was in the quote.
I did mention that the quote. Sorry, one sec. The quote I mentioned. Other than that, I mean, this is probably going to be a pretty popular one with us and with readers in general. But the way that Pynchon anthropomorphizes the learned English dog is really interesting. And a lot of other authors just either wouldn't go there or wouldn't give such a massive chunk of time to something that's kind of in some ways a silly kind of children's book type thing.
Or would give too much to it, honestly.
Yeah, one of the two, because it does seem to strike a very, we see him in the beginning, and it's very interesting, but it seems to it's not too much and it's not too little either. It's a very good amount where we get to know him a little bit. He expresses his personality, and then the narrative just kind of moves on. We've talked about this before, but he does the same kind of thing in Against the Day with the Chums of Chance and their dog. Who I'm blanking on the name of that dog, but Pugnax, yeah. But it does seem to be kind of a recurring theme for him.
As a side note on the dog, and this could be way off base, but it did remind me of the movie Up. Not in that the dog in this book is wearing a collar, but the one in Up does have a collar on that has a red LED light on it that turns on whenever it speaks. And given that the abbreviation of this is LED, I couldn't help but wonder if the writers of that movie maybe had read this and pulled some inspiration from it.
I honestly wouldn't be surprised. Like the Pixar's got some good writers, and I would not be surprised if they were Pynchon fans.
Yeah, no, me neither. My most Pynchon part of the chapter was the Bill Clinton joke. The idea that you would spend so long learning how to write a book like this, because there's no way that he did that overnight. There was probably a significant chunk of time where he was figuring out how to get the language right and how to nail down the prose style and all of that. And then within, 30 pages of it, still not being able to keep yourself from including a joke about Bill Clinton in there. That just struck me as being one of the greatest, anachronisms I've ever read, but also just being quintessentially Pynchon.
Yeah, that actually was going to be exactly what I was going to pick as well. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, and it's a lot like the Nixon quote unquote quote in Gravity's Rainbow.
In Gravity's Rainbow for part 4, yeah.
Where it's this very contemporaneous to the publication choice, just thrown in there, basically just for a laugh.
Yeah. What about you, Will? Did you have a most Pynchon part?
Well, unfortunately, Luke did steal mine. But I will do something of, I guess, a borrow from you, Kate. You did mention the LED, and the LED blinks, shivers, nods in a resigned way. You are hardly the first to ask. And the rest of what he says is not relevant. But just the choice to insert the LED blinks, shivers. Come on, that's obvious. But it's also super clever because, Learned English Dog is not a name for Pynchon that's super attention grabby.
No, it's very subtle for him, which, yeah.
It's conceptually grabby,
yes,
but not the words that he's using.
Yeah. Well, to wrap up, we actually did have a question from a listener that I wanted to bring up. I think it's especially relevant now, and we've talked about this off, off record, I guess, so to speak. But Dylan sent us an email, and he asked, or they asked, I should say, I have really enjoyed your Crying on Block 49 series. I was wondering if or when you plan on doing one with Vineland. It's next on my list, and it'd be fun to be able to plan to read along. There are very little companions for Vineland out there right now. Definitely, there are not many companions, if any, companions for Vineland that I know of off the top of my head. I love Vineland. I think it gets dunked on a lot, and I think that's relatively unfair. It gets thrown into that phrase I hate of pinch on light, which I think is incredibly reductive. I think it's a really good book. It's not his best, but it's way better than people give it credit for. And for anyone who is not in the know on why this is irrelevant to the time question, there is rumors circulating through Hollywood that P.T. Anderson's next movie is going to be an adaptation of Vineland. I have to underline the word rumor because there is absolutely no confirmation of this as of the recording of this. It is speculative at best. There was a casting call that went out a while ago that kind of started all of this, and he's mentioned before wanting to adapt it before he did Inherent Vice. So we talked about this while we were working on Lot 49, and I think we all kind of agreed, and anybody correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think we wanted to wait and see what came of the rumors, because if it is in fact going to be his next film, then we may end up doing it after this to kind of line up with when the movie comes out. But we really don't know. So I don't want to say, we're going to do it after this or we're going to do it here or there. Really and truthfully, we haven't mapped out what we're doing after this as of right now. We're just trying to take it one book at a time. And as we get closer to the end of Mason and Dixon, we'll start talking amongst ourselves about what we're going to do next. But I thought it was a good opportunity just to real quickly have everyone kind of mention, what do you feel about Vineland? Like, how did you come away from that one?
There are parts of Vineland I really enjoy. It is probably on like the lower tier of pension for me. There are some really cool parts though, and it is kind of, it has some similarities with the Crying of Block 49 in that it does kind of have some like, I know that the phrase like strong female character can get a little bit of heat. I've seen some stuff about Hollywood actresses not liking that phrase or phrases similar to that, but it has some of my favorite parts of any pension novel. One part of Vineland that I find myself thinking about a lot is the part where Zoid is watching TV and he keeps on watching TV in the hope, like late at night when assumedly he's really stoned and he's just sitting there watching TV hoping that his ex-wife will show up on the TV at some point. That's a part of that book that really stuck with me. So there are parts of it I really enjoy. Overall, I just found it a little bit all over the place, I guess.
I actually would rank Vineland higher on my list. It could be that I read it after I read Infinite Jest. It just as sort of a comparison piece, kind of, because they both deal heavily with entertainment and television. But I think that the elements of that book that are sort of about a critique of modern American entertainment consumption and culture have only gained in relevance since the book was published. I think that its high degree of absurdity that it has sort of intentionally mirrors the kind of absurd programming that the book is talking about. So I am actually probably a bigger fan of Vineland than a lot of people are. I really enjoy the book. I think that it provides a lot to talk about, especially in how it's aged from the time that it was written until now. And think that there's a lot to explore there that people kind of leave behind. It does have probably way too many characters from a standpoint of the actual named cast that's in it. But, as it stands out as a book, I'm quite a fan personally.
Yeah, I'm a fan as well. Sorry, I don't know why I can't phrase this sentence. It's the book of his that I think is both in terms of timeline and in terms of its contents, it really is an ugly stepchild in a lot of ways. Because you can absolutely sit there and nerd out about how V through Lot 49 through Gravity's Rainbow demonstrates a shift in like perspective from a young beat to a postmodernist philosopher or whatever, and you can sit and talk about how Mason and Dixon and Against the Day and Inherent Vice to a lesser extent and Bleeding Edge, they have real female characters. They have real characters in general. They have real storylines and real humanity to them. And what Vineland is to me is basically Pynchon writing just a family drama. I think all of that media critique is there, but it is just a family drama, and that is not what people want out of Thomas Pynchon. And what they don't want, and what people want from family dramas is not Thomas Pynchon essentially trying to figure out just how long he can do his backdoor introductions in a row. Because that's what that book is on a structural level. So I was talking to this person, and they started talking about this other person, who was this person in regard to that other person. Where you have these pockets of dialogue that morph into narrative that only exist to provide context for an earlier conversation or a later conversation. And I love that. I think it's one of his best tricks. I think he does it perfectly throughout most of the book. I think the characters are all, at least, all of the characters who have more than one dimension, which that's the first book which really does that. The multidimensionality of the real characters, or of the main characters, is very real. It is not just it's not just goofy. It's not just like Commedia dell'arte style stock characters. And I love all of that when you combine it with the fact that, to me at least, and this is not my idea, but it's not a super common conclusion either, that it's a gender swapped version of the Odyssey. And I don't see why people don't appreciate those things, except that they don't expect it.
Well, I think part of it, I think part of the lukewarm response to it, we'll call that, is the fact that it's coming off the heels of Gravity's Rainbow, and so long after that. I think that people expected he's been gone for almost 20 years, and then this is what he comes back with. When again, I think that's a reductive thing to say, but he was also, that wasn't the only thing he was working on during that time. And I think that it was just a matter of, that was the one that was done at the time. And, he could continue working on Mason and Dixon and Against the Day. But yeah, I think everything that Will mentioned is absolutely correct. I love it. I think it's a great book. I don't think it's his best, but it's a shame that, really, you could make the argument, it's a shame that everything after Gravity's Rainbow doesn't really have the companions for it that it should. But that's kind of where we are. So
yeah, almost anything that he would have published after Gravity's Rainbow would have been probably, to some degree, sort of swept to the side by critics.
Yeah, simply
because it wasn't Gravity's Rainbow.
Yeah,
and waiting as long as it was, to your point, for that book to come out did not help matters.
Yeah, and that's true of almost any artist in almost any medium. You have these long gaps in between projects, especially a project that's as beloved as it is, as Gravity's Rainbow was, so that almost inevitably whatever you put out after that is going to be held up to that lens. And if it's not Gravity's Rainbow 2.0, it's just, it's not going to be good in their eyes. So, but that is what it is. We'll see what happens with the movie. I think P.T. Anderson would be the right choice to do it. I think he did great with Inherent Vice. So if that's the case, if that's what he's working on, I'm excited for it. Yeah, I'm just excited he's working on a new movie, to be honest.
Yeah. And I know in I know in March that there was an article that was released where a journalist had spoken to PTA about what he was working on, and one of the projects was very nebulous. He just said it was about war veterans in their 50s. But the other one, he said, was a father-daughter story that has a plot about the GOP and martial arts.
Yeah, which is pretty spot on.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I'm honest though, I love Paul Thomas Anderson. I think if he adapted Vineland, he would do a decent job. But my ideal would be for somebody to like stick at, Quentin Tarantino from the late 90s in a Ludovico machine type situation to force him to like have some awareness of things outside of his libido, and then feed him some acid and have him make Vineland. I think that would be about the right tone. But that person doesn't exist for some reason.
Yeah.
I think one of the reasons people are skeptical about Paul Thomas Anderson doing Vineland is, Inherent Vice. I think it was critically a success, and I think among fans of Pynchon and Paul Thomas Anderson, it was mostly a success. But it did not make money. Inherent Vice did not make any money.
No.
And it hasn't. I mean, it is somewhat of a cult classic, I would say, but it hasn't. It's not like Blade Runner or something where it's like, it's demanding a sequel or something. You know what I'm saying? Like, it doesn't have that big of a cultural impact. It hasn't had.
Well, even Blade Runner, to your point, Luke, when they released the sequel to that also lost money at the box office.
Yeah.
So they massively overestimated the word cult in reference to that film as well.
Well, on top of all that, I mean, Inherent Vice is probably his least popular movie, which is a shame to say because it's not his worst movie. Okay, I'm sorry. I forgot about Hard 8. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is a great movie. I have to say, it is a fantastic film. If you haven't seen it, go see it.
Did that one actually get a full theatrical release? I didn't think it did.
I think it was a very limited release. Because the studio changed the name. He wanted to call it Sydney. And the studio forced him to change the name.
Huh. Well, and I haven't seen it yet, but people always compare The Master to Pynchon's novels. And so I think a lot of... I just think a lot of that...
Admittedly inspired by V. And he was that movie was supposed to have the alligator in the sewer subplot.
One thing that I will say about Inherent Vice, and it struck me after repeated viewings, but Inherent Vice is, to me at least in some ways, an adaptation of all of Pynchon's works. It does seem to capture Pynchon's like worldview, especially as it concerns America, in a way that I think kind of rises above just the book Inherent Vice and seems to kind of be a more like broad, kind of more like like the vibes of Pynchon novels. It seems to be adapting that kind of a thing rather than Inherent Vice specifically.
Yeah, he does strike a very good line between retelling the events of that book and also getting at a broader thematic point about America and about land abuse and all of that. To the point that was made about it losing money at the box office, I would love a book to be written about how that film even got made, because the amount of actors that are in it, for in some cases like 5 minutes of screen time, or even less, like Eric Roberts as Mickey Wolfman is in the film in like 2 pictures and in like 2 minutes of actual dialogue.
Michael K. Williams is on for like 30 seconds.
Yeah, but like every single person who is in that film is a really solid actor or like a incredibly famous actor as well. And to get all of them on board and to get, enough money on board to shoot the entire thing on cameras that were from the 70s on original film stock, like that is not a small undertaking. And I'm just so curious how that was done. I would love someone to actually do like a deep dive into the production of that film. Yeah. But I doubt that'll ever happen.
One can only hope.
You got to consider that, like, that point in time. When did the movie come out? 2011?
2011 or 12?
It might be 13.
It might
He
be.
had Anderson had just come off of his most critically successful movie. He hadn't, quote unquote, missed since Hard Eight, right?
He's never had a film that was critically under like 80% on any kind of metric.
Yeah. The Coen brothers were at their peak in terms of popularity. And at the same time, different style of kind of same outdoors type director, but Wes Anderson was out there, and he has some similar aesthetic sensibilities to P.T. Anderson. I mean, it was really a perfect time for P.T. Anderson to rip a bunch of Hollywood people off.
It's true. I mean, and I think he's commanded enough respect as a director that I'm sure a lot of those actors just were chomping at the bit to work with him. So, that's how you get Martin Short to play Rudy Blatnoyd. In perfect character. Like, he was perfect for that.
Absolutely
perfect. I could talk about P.T. Anderson and Inherent Vice all day, so I don't want to get too off in the weeds. So with that being said, Dylan, thank you so much for the question. And I hope our answer wasn't too long-winded and just all over the place, but so please, send us an email if you have any questions, mappingthezonepod@gmail.com. The next section we are going to read, so for anyone unfamiliar right now, we are following the Mason and Dixon reading group from the subreddit. So you can get a full breakdown on there of how we're going to do this, at least for now. If anything changes and we are going to change things up, we'll absolutely let you know. But for our next episode, we are going to read chapters 6 through 10. So it's about the same page numbers, roughly 50-ish. So we will be back next week to discuss chapters 6 through 10. Thank you again to Connor for editing for us. We really appreciate it. And thank you so much for all the effort that you put into doing it. And you're doing a really great job, and I can't thank you enough. So thank you all for listening, and we will see you all next week.
Bye.
See ya.
Bye.